Imagine a kingdom covered in ice. It is the bitter winter of 1788 in France. The rivers are frozen solid. The large wooden water wheels along the rivers cannot turn. Because the wheels cannot turn, wheat cannot be ground into flour. And without flour, bread cannot be baked. In a small bakery in Paris, a mother stares at empty shelves. Just 12 miles away, inside the Palace of Versailles, a king walks through halls lined with gold and mirrors. A warm fire crackles in his fireplace. The mother has nothing. The king has everything. This is not just a story of a cold winter. This is the story of how an entire world turned upside down. Welcome to the French Revolution. Over the next hour, we will travel through one of the most dramatic and violent periods in human history. We will see how ideas of freedom sparked brutal wars. We will watch powerful kings fall and ordinary people rise. As we explore this history, we will also explore the English language. I will guide you through the vocabulary of power, rebellion, and society. Let us start by looking at how France was organized. To understand why a society breaks, we must first understand how it is built. In the 1780s, France operated under an ancient system. Listen for this word: hierarchy. A hierarchy is a system where people are ranked one above the other according to status or power. In historical English, we often talk about the social hierarchy. The French hierarchy was divided into 3 distinct groups. They called these groups the 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy, the leaders of the church. The second estate was the nobility, the wealthy families with ancient titles, castles, and privileges. Together, these 2 estates made up only about 2% of the population, yet they owned most of the land. More importantly, they paid almost no taxes. Then there was the third estate. This was everyone else, from wealthy city merchants and lawyers to poor farmers and street workers. 98% of the people belonged to the third estate. They did the heavy labor. They produced the food. And they paid the heavy taxes that kept the country running. A farmer working in the dirt looked up at the castle on the hill and felt a deep, growing anger. This is where biology mirrors society. When the human stomach is empty for too long, the body begins to consume itself. When a society is starved of fairness, it begins to tear itself apart from the inside. But why was France suddenly failing in the late 1780s? The answer involves a strange historical twist. It involves an ocean, a rival empire, and a massive amount of money. Listen to this phrase: on the brink. When a country is on the brink, it is at the very edge of a disaster. France was on the brink of financial ruin. They were drowning in debt. Debt is money that is owed to someone else. France had borrowed millions. Why? To fight their bitter rival, Great Britain. A few years earlier, 13 British colonies in North America had rebelled against their king. You might know this as the American Revolution. The French king, Louis XVI, hated the British. So, he decided to help the Americans. He sent French ships, French soldiers, and French gold across the Atlantic Ocean. The twist is quite ironic. The American Revolution was a great victory for the French military, but it was a disaster for the French treasury. King Louis spent so much money helping the Americans fight for their freedom that he bankrupted his own country. Even worse, the French soldiers who fought in America brought something dangerous back home. They brought back ideas. They had seen a revolution succeed. They started talking about liberty, equality, and the idea that a king is not born to rule forever. So, by 1789, we have a perfect storm. The government is entirely out of money. The common people are burdened with crushing taxes. The soldiers are whispering about freedom. And then, the weather strikes. The summer of 1788 brought terrible hailstorms that destroyed the crops. Then came the freezing winter. Listen for this word: famine. A famine is a severe shortage of food that causes widespread hunger. By the spring of 1789, Paris was on the edge of a famine. The price of a single loaf of bread rose so high that it cost a poor worker a whole month's wages. Imagine that for a moment. Working for 30 days, from sunrise to sunset, just to buy one loaf of bread. King Louis XVI realized his country was breaking. He needed to raise taxes, but the people had nothing left to give. In a desperate move, he called a massive meeting of all three estates. This meeting was called the Estates General. It had not met for over a century. When the representatives of the common people arrived at Versailles, they were treated with disrespect. They were told to wear simple black clothes. They were made to wait in the rain. They quickly realized the king did not want to hear their problems. He only wanted their money. But the commoners had a different plan. They were tired of the old rules. What happens when a desperate crowd realizes its own strength? And how does a simple meeting turn into a spark that burns down a kingdom? A locked wooden door. In the history of the world, a simple locked door rarely starts a revolution. But on a rainy morning in June 1789, it did exactly that. The representatives of the Third Estate arrived at the Grand Meeting Hall in Versailles. They expected to continue discussing the future of France. Instead, they found the great doors chained shut. Royal guards stood outside in the rain, crossing their weapons to block the entrance. The king's message was silent but clear. Your voices do not matter. Go home. Why was the king suddenly so threatened? Because the commoners were demanding a change to the fundamental rules. In the Estates General, the voting system was deeply unfair. Voting was not based on the number of people. It was based on the group. Each of the three estates received exactly one vote. Because the wealthy clergy and the rich nobles shared the same interests, they always voted together. Even though the Third Estate represented 98% of the entire country, they were continuously outvoted 2-1. Listen for this phrase: a demand for equal rights. Say it softly to yourself. A demand for equal rights. The commoners were no longer just asking for cheaper bread. They were making a demand for equal rights. They wanted every representative in the room to have an individual vote. Where did this bold, dangerous idea come from? It came from a powerful intellectual movement spreading across Europe. Listen for this word: Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period when philosophers began to value human reason and science over ancient traditions and absolute kings. Writers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued a shocking new concept. They argued that power does not come from a divine God. They argued that power comes from the people. They believed every human being is born with natural, basic rights that no ruler can take away. Filled with these Enlightenment ideas, the locked-out commoners did not go home. They walked together down the wet streets of Versailles. They searched for any building large enough to hold over 500 angry, determined men. They found an indoor royal tennis court. Imagine the scene. They crowded inside the empty, echoing hall. There were no chairs, only bare walls and high windows. One by one, the men raised their right hands. In a moment of incredible bravery, they made a solemn promise. They declared themselves the true representatives of the people, adopting a new name, the National Assembly. They swore an oath that they would never leave and would continue to meet wherever necessary until they had created a completely new foundation for the country. They demanded a constitution. Listen closely to this concept as it changed the modern world. In historical English, a constitution is a formal written document that establishes the basic rules of a nation, and most importantly, limits the power of the government. Before this moment, the French king's power was absolute. His word was the law. Now the commoners wanted to place his power inside a cage of written rules. History remembers this defining moment as the tennis court oath. The king was suddenly trapped by this political defiance. Listen for this word, defiance. Defiance means open resistance or bold disobedience. The king could not simply arrest the entire National Assembly without starting a massive riot. So, King Louis XVI did something highly deceptive. Publicly, he smiled. He ordered the First and Second Estates to join this new National Assembly. He pretended to accept their demand for a constitution, but privately, in the dark corridors of his palace, he was terrified. He knew he could not trust his own French soldiers. The regular French guards were hungry and poor, just like the commoners. If ordered to shoot the crowds, they might refuse. Therefore, the king sent secret messages across the borders. He called for foreign mercenaries. Thousands of heavily armed Swiss and German soldiers began to march toward Paris. They set up military camps just outside the city. The people of Paris watched from their windows. They saw the dangerous glint of steel swords. They saw heavy brass cannons being positioned, pointing directly at their neighborhoods. The streets of Paris hummed with a dark, nervous energy. The bakeries were still empty. Stomachs were still growling. Now, deep fear mixed with the hunger. Rumors flew through the narrow streets like a contagious disease. The king is going to burn the city. The king is going to arrest our leaders. The foreign soldiers will attack tonight. Let us pause and look at where we stand. We have seen a peaceful meeting turn into an act of historic defiance. The commoners demanded a constitution and formed a new assembly. In response, the king has secretly surrounded Paris with thousands of foreign troops. The citizens of Paris are trapped. They are starving. They are angry. And they are terrified of the impending military strike. If the king's army attacks, how will the ordinary people defend themselves? They desperately need weapons. They need gunpowder. And there's only one place in Paris where they can find it. A dark, towering stone fortress that holds the nightmares of an entire nation. A single, heavy iron bell begins to ring out across the rooftops of Paris. It is the morning of July 14th, 1789. and a city of over 600,000 people has just decided to go to war against its own king. The citizens of Paris had watched the foreign soldiers gathering outside their city for days. They knew an attack was coming. Driven by the primal instinct to survive, the people took action. First, thousands of ordinary men and women broke into a military building called Les Invalides. They overpowered the guards and stole nearly 30,000 muskets. But there was a critical problem. Guns without gunpowder are just heavy wooden sticks. The people needed powder to defend their homes, and they knew exactly where to find it. Listen to this verb, to storm. In historical English, to storm does not mean bad weather. It means to suddenly and violently attack a place. You can practice saying this simple phrase. The crowd decided to storm the fortress. The crowd of thousands marched through the narrow streets, aiming to storm a massive medieval fortress located on the eastern side of Paris. This fortress was called the Bastille. To understand why the Bastille was so important, you must visualize it. It was a terrifying structure. 8 massive stone towers rose high into the sky, casting dark shadows over the neighborhood. Its walls were 30 feet thick. It was surrounded by a deep ditch filled with water. Inside, it held hundreds of barrels of precious gunpowder. But the Bastille was much more than a military storage building. For centuries, it had served as a secret royal prison. Listen for this word, tyranny. Tyranny is the cruel, unfair, and absolute control by a government or a single ruler. For generations of French people, the Bastille was the physical shape of royal tyranny. If the king was angry with a writer, a politician, or a commoner, he simply signed a secret letter. The person would be dragged into the Bastille in the middle of the night, sometimes never to be seen again. Therefore, marching on the Bastille was a deeply symbolic act. The people were not just going to get gunpowder. They were going to tear down the symbol of their oppression. Let us look at another useful term. Listen for this word, uprising. An uprising is a sudden act of rebellion against a government. What had started as a political debate had now transformed into a violent uprising. Inside the Bastille, the governor of the fortress, a man named Delaunay, looked down from the high stone walls. He was terrified. He commanded only a small number of guards. Below him was a sea of furious, desperate faces. He saw shoemakers, carpenters, furious mothers, and even a few French soldiers who had abandoned the king to join the uprising. Delaunay tried to negotiate. He invited a few representatives inside to talk, but the massive crowd outside grew impatient. They thought their representatives had been arrested. The biological response of the crowd shifted rapidly. Fear transformed into adrenaline, and adrenaline ignited into a collective, blinding rage. 2 brave men climbed onto the roof of a nearby building and smashed the heavy iron chains holding the outer drawbridge. The wooden bridge crashed down with a deafening boom. The crowd surged forward into the courtyard. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. No one knows for certain who fired first. Historians debate the exact sequence of events. But the result was immediate chaos. The guards on the walls opened fire into the dense crowd below. The thick, choking smell of black powder smoke filled the summer air. Citizens fell screaming to the cobblestones. The people fired back with their stolen muskets. After several hours of bloody and intense fighting, the impossible happened. The massive, invincible fortress surrendered. The furious mob stormed inside. They freed the prisoners, though, ironically, there were only 7 prisoners left inside at the time. They seized the gunpowder. But the crowd's anger could not be easily stopped. They captured Governor Delaunay. Despite his pleas for mercy, he was dragged through the streets and brutally killed. His head was placed on a long wooden spear and paraded through the city. A sudden, shocking escalation. The people of Paris had crossed a line of no return. Late that night, a messenger rode his horse as fast as possible to the palace of Versailles. He woke King Louis XVI from his sleep to deliver the shocking news. The Bastille had fallen. The king's absolute authority in Paris was broken. According to a famous historical account, the confused king looked at the messenger and asked, "Is it a revolt?" The messenger shook his head and replied, "No, sire. It is a revolution. We have watched a hungry, desperate crowd transform into an army. The spark of the French Revolution has officially ignited. The Bastille, the great symbol of tyranny, is in the hands of the people." But a dark and dangerous loop has been opened. Violence was used to achieve freedom, and it was successful. When a king's power is suddenly broken, who steps forward to make the new laws? And how do the people build a fair society when their streets are already stained with blood? Imagine tearing down a mountain with your bare hands. That is exactly what the people of Paris did to the Bastille, breaking it apart stone by heavy stone. In the days following the fall of the fortress in July 1789, the citizens did not just leave the building empty, they destroyed it. They passed the stones down a long human chain. Entrepreneurial citizens even carved the stones into miniature models of the Bastille and sold them as souvenirs of liberty. But while Paris celebrated, a new emotion was rushing through the French countryside like a biological virus. It was a fast, uncontrollable panic. Historians call this period the Great Fear. Rumors flew from village to village. The poor farmers heard that the angry nobles were hiring gangs of armed bandits to burn their crops and starve them into submission. When fear infects a society, people rarely wait to be attacked. They strike first. Listen for this word: peasant. In historical English, a peasant is a poor farmer of low social status who works on a small piece of land. The peasants of France grabbed their farming tools, pitchforks, and torches. They marched on the stone castles of the nobility. They did not just break windows, they had a specific target. They went straight for the libraries and record rooms. They burned the ancient paper documents that recorded their debts and their legal obligations to the lords. They were erasing their own slavery with fire. News of these burning castles reached the National Assembly in Paris. The leaders realized they had to do something drastic to calm the violent countryside. On the night of August 4th, 1789, they made a historic decision. Listen for this verb: to abolish. To abolish means to formally put an end to a system, a practice, or an institution. You can practice this simple phrase: the leaders voted to abolish the old laws. That night, the assembly completely abolished the ancient system of feudalism. Feudalism was the strict social system where peasants were legally tied to the land and forced to work for the nobles. In a matter of hours, centuries of noble privilege were legally wiped away. A few weeks later, the Assembly took another massive step. They wrote a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It was deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinkers and by the American Declaration of Independence. This document was revolutionary. It stated clearly that all men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. It stated that the purpose of any government is to protect those natural rights. This was the intellectual foundation they needed to write their new constitution. The absolute power of the French king was officially dead on paper. But there was a fatal problem. Beautiful words on paper cannot feed a starving child. By October of 1789, the weather was turning cold again. The harvest had been poor. In the markets of Paris, there was still no bread. This brings us to one of the most remarkable scenes of the Revolution. It started with the women. Specifically, the women who worked in the fish markets of Paris. These were tough, strong women who spent their days carrying heavy loads and cutting fish with sharp, heavy knives. On the morning of October 5th, a young woman began beating a drum in the market. A crowd gathered. The hunger in their bellies turned into a fierce, focused anger. They realized that while they starved in Paris, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were still out in the luxurious Palace of Versailles, supposedly throwing massive banquets. Listen for this word: mob. A mob is a large, disorganized, and often violent crowd of people. A mob of thousands of women began to march in the freezing rain. They walked for 12 miles, pulling heavy iron cannons behind them, carrying pitchforks, axes, and muskets. They were marching to Versailles to demand bread directly from the king. When this massive, soaking wet, heavily armed mob arrived at the Golden Gates of Versailles, the royal guards were stunned. The king, unsure of what to do, agreed to send food to Paris. He hoped the women would simply go home. But the women did not leave. They camped outside the palace in the rain. Early the next morning, a small group found an unguarded gate. The situation rapidly turned violent. The mob broke into the palace. They ran through the glittering halls, shouting angry threats. They were specifically searching for the Queen, Marie Antoinette, whom they hated for her supposed extreme wealth and Austrian background. Historians note that the Queen barely escaped. She ran through a secret door connected to her bedroom. Just moments before the mob smashed through her main doors and tore her bed to pieces with their knives. To stop the bloodshed, King Louis XVI was forced to step out onto a high balcony and face the angry crowd below. The mob made a final, absolute demand. The king must leave his beautiful, isolated palace. He must move to Paris, into the heart of the dirty, starving city where the people could watch him. Defeated, the king agreed. That afternoon, the royal carriage rolled slowly toward Paris. It was surrounded by thousands of marching women. Leading the procession were men carrying the severed heads of the king's royal guards on long wooden pikes. The king was alive, but he was effectively a prisoner in his own capital. We have watched a monarch lose his army, his fortress, his laws, and now his home. The people have seized physical control of the government. But a dangerous question remains. The king is trapped, and he is signing their new laws. But does he truly accept this constitution, or is he secretly plotting to destroy it? And what will the other powerful kings of Europe do when they see a fellow monarch dragged through the mud? Imagine a king dressing up as a common servant, sneaking out of his own palace in the dead of night, and running away from his own people. By the summer of 1791, King Louis XVI had been a virtual prisoner in Paris for nearly 2 years. The revolution was changing everything around him. The National Assembly had rewritten the laws. The powerful Catholic Church had its lands taken away and sold to pay the country's massive debts. The king was losing control, and he felt deeply trapped. He decided it was time to run. Listen for this word: disguised. To be disguised means to change your appearance or clothes so that people do not recognize who you are. The royal family disguised themselves to escape. The king dressed in the simple brown coat of a servant. The queen, Marie Antoinette, dressed as a regular governess. Late at night, on June 20th, they slipped past the sleeping guards. They climbed into a heavy, dark wooden carriage. The carriage rolled quietly out of Paris, heading east toward the border of the Austrian Netherlands. There, loyal troops and foreign allies were waiting to protect them. The king believed that if he could just reach the border, he could gather an army, march back to Paris, and crush the revolution. For a day and a half, the disguise worked. They were almost safe. But in a small town called Varennes, their luck finally ran out. A local postmaster noticed the carriage. He looked closely at the man inside. One very famous historical account claims the postmaster recognized the king's face because he had seen it stamped on a common French coin. Historians debate exactly how the recognition happened, but the result is a confirmed fact. The town guards stopped the carriage. The King of France was arrested by his own ordinary citizens. When the royal family was brought back to Paris, the atmosphere in the city was terrifying. Before, the crowds had yelled and thrown stones, but this time, the streets were completely silent. The leaders of the city had printed posters with a strict warning: "Whoever applauds the king shall be beaten. Whoever insults him shall be hanged." Thousands of citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, simply staring with cold, hard eyes, as the humiliated king was dragged back to his palace. This is where biology mirrors society once again. Trust is the invisible immune system of a nation. When a human immune system fails, the body begins to attack itself. When trust in a leader completely dies, a nation falls into a severe, paranoid sickness. The people realized a harsh truth. Their king did not want to share power. He wanted to escape, find a foreign army, and wage war against them. Listen for this word: treason. Treason is the highest crime of betraying your own country, especially by attempting to overthrow the government. In the eyes of the people, King Louis XVI had just committed treason. Because of this betrayal, a radical new idea began to grow in the streets of Paris. The people no longer just wanted a constitution that limited the king's power. They wanted to get rid of the throne entirely. Listen closely to this concept, as it is a core keyword in the history of government. A republic. A republic is a country where power is held by the people and their elected representatives, and there is no king or queen. You can practice saying this simple phrase: the people demanded a true republic. To demand a republic in 1791 was a dangerous, extreme position. It split the revolutionaries apart. Listen for this word: faction. A faction is a smaller, organized group within a larger political movement, often fighting for their own specific ideas. The French revolutionaries broke into competing factions. One faction, sitting on the right side of the assembly hall, wanted to keep the king, but limit his power. Another faction, sitting on the left side of the hall, wanted a pure republic. As an interesting English learning note, this seating arrangement is exactly where we get the modern political terms: the left and the right. The most powerful and extreme faction on the left was a political club called the Jacobins. The Jacobins believed the revolution had not gone far enough. They believed the enemies of freedom were everywhere: inside the palace, inside the church, and across the borders. They were brilliant speakers, and they knew how to use the anger of the poor workers in Paris to their advantage. The situation was like a pile of dry wood, waiting for a single spark. And the kings of neighboring European countries provided that spark. The rulers of Austria and Prussia looked at France and felt a deep, freezing dread. If the French people could arrest their king, what would stop the Austrian or Prussian people from doing the same thing? To protect their own crowns, these foreign kings issued a formal threat. They declared that if King Louis XVI was harmed, they would burn Paris to the ground. They thought this threat would make the French people surrender. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It proved to the French people that their king was secretly allied with foreign enemies. We have watched a king try to flee his country in disguise, only to be dragged back in absolute silence. We have seen trust shatter, replaced by accusations of treason. The demand for a republic is rising, and aggressive political factions are taking control. But a massive problem is rushing toward them. The massive, highly trained armies of Austria and Prussia are gathering at the borders. France is disorganized, bankrupt, and politically divided. How does a newborn, chaotic revolution fight against the greatest military powers in Europe? And what will the people do to the king who brought this war to their doorstep? Imagine standing in a crowded city square, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thud of enemy cannons. Miles away, the greatest armies in Europe are marching toward Paris, and the desperate people have only one target left to blame: their own king. By the scorching summer of 1792, the situation in France was critical. The nation was officially at war. The powerful traditional empires of Austria and Prussia had launched a massive military campaign against the disorganized French forces. Listen for this word: invasion. An invasion is an instance of a foreign army entering a country by force to take control. You can practice this simple phrase: the foreign invasion terrified the citizens. The invading armies were pushing deep into French territory, winning battle after battle. To make matters worse, the commander of the foreign army issued a devastating public letter. He warned that if the French people harmed King Louis XVI in any way, his foreign troops would completely destroy Paris. He intended to frighten the revolutionaries into surrendering. Instead, his threat had the opposite effect. It convinced the people of Paris that their king was secretly working with the enemy. This fear reached a violent boiling point on August 10, 1792. Tens of thousands of armed citizens, joined by sympathetic French soldiers, marched on the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family was living. The king's personal guards, the famous Swiss mercenaries, stood in their bright red uniforms, ready to defend the palace. A brutal, chaotic battle erupted right inside the elegant royal gardens. The heavy smoke of musket fire choked the air. Historians estimate that over 1,000 people died that day in the terrible crossfire. The king and his family fled the palace, running to the government assembly hall to hide. But the damage was done. The people had shed blood to conquer the royal home, and they demanded the absolute end of the monarchy. The government had no choice but to listen to the armed, victorious crowd. They officially suspended the king from his duties and locked him and his family in a dark, heavily guarded stone prison. France was no longer a kingdom. A newly elected government, called the National Convention, took control. They officially declared France a republic. Listen to this profound shift in language. The new government abolished all royal titles. They banned words like Lord or Your Majesty. Instead, everyone was forced to use a new, equalizing title. Listen for this word, citizen. A citizen is a legally recognized subject of a state or commonwealth. In the new French Republic, whether you were a poor baker or a wealthy lawyer, you were simply called citizen. Even the fallen king was stripped of his royal name and referred to as Citizen Louis Capet. But what does a new republic do with a former king? This dangerous question divided the new government into fierce factions. Listen for this word, radical. A radical is someone who advocates for complete, extreme political or social change. The most radical leaders, such as the brilliant and cold Maximilien Robespierre, argued that, as long as Louis XVI lived, the Republic would never truly be safe. Robespierre famously argued a terrifying logic. The king must die so that the country can live. In December 1792, citizen Louis Capet was put on trial for high treason against the nation. The elected deputies of the National Convention acted as his judges. After weeks of intense, passionate debate, they took a final vote. Listen for this word, verdict. A verdict is the final, formal decision made in a legal trial. Practice saying this phrase aloud. The government delivered a guilty verdict. The verdict for the former king was guilty. By a very narrow margin of votes, the punishment was decided. Death. On a freezing, foggy morning in January 1793, the man who was once the absolute ruler of France was placed in a simple wooden cart. He was driven through the silent, heavily guarded streets of Paris to a large public square. Waiting for him in the square was a new, highly efficient machine. It was called the guillotine. The guillotine consisted of a tall wooden frame with a heavy angled steel blade hanging at the top. It was designed by a doctor who believed it was a more humane, painless way to execute criminals, compared to the brutal old methods of hanging or the sword. When Louis XVI climbed the wooden stairs to the guillotine, he tried to speak to the enormous crowd. Evidence suggests he declared his innocence and forgave his enemies. But the commanding military officer suddenly ordered the soldiers to beat their heavy drums, completely drowning out the king's final words. The heavy steel blade fell. The execution of the king sent a massive shockwave across the world. Kings in Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands were absolutely horrified. They immediately joined the war against France. Now, the new French Republic was fighting almost the entire continent of Europe. This is where biology mirrors society again. When a human body experiences a massive trauma, it goes into shock, shutting down non-essential systems and hyper-focusing only on survival. The French Republic went into severe political shock. To survive the massive foreign invasions and the violent internal rebellions spreading across the French countryside, the radical leaders seized absolute control. They created a special committee, ominously named the Committee of Public Safety. This small group of men, led by Robespierre, was given the power to do whatever was necessary to protect the revolution. They set aside the constitution they had fought so hard to build. They suspended the natural rights of the citizens. They decided that the only way to hold the breaking nation together was through absolute fear. They decided to use terror as a deliberate weapon of the state. We have watched a monarch lose his palace, his crown, and finally, his life. The French Republic has officially been born. But it is entirely surrounded by angry foreign empires. A very dark loop has just opened. The radical leaders have created a government committee with absolute power to hunt down traitors to the Republic. But when the definition of a traitor keeps changing every single day, how does anyone stay safe? And what happens when the revolution turns its sharpest weapon, the guillotine, against the very people who created it? Imagine waking up every single morning, looking out your window, and wondering if your own neighbor is going to report you to the secret police. By the autumn of 1793, the bright, hopeful days of the early revolution were entirely gone. The streets of Paris no longer echoed with joyful songs about liberty. Instead, they echoed with a new, terrifying sound. It was the slow, heavy rumble of wooden carts rolling over the stone streets. These carts were called tumbrils, and their only purpose was to carry condemned prisoners from the dark dungeons to the guillotine. The radical faction in the government, led by a strict and intensely serious lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, had taken absolute control of the country. Listen for this word: terror. Terror is an overwhelming, paralyzing feeling of fear. But in France in 1793, it was no longer just an emotion. It became an official policy. Robespierre famously declared that in times of revolution, terror is nothing more than swift, severe, and inflexible justice. He believed that to save the Republic, he had to destroy its internal enemies at any cost. History remembers this bloody period simply as the Reign of Terror. To achieve this goal, the Committee of Public Safety passed a terrifying new law called the Law of Suspects. Listen for this word: paranoia. Paranoia is the irrational and persistent feeling that people are trying to secretly harm you. The law of suspects infected the entire nation with extreme paranoia. Under this new law, you did not need to commit a violent crime to be arrested. You could be sent to the guillotine simply for your thoughts, your words, or your associations. If you complained about the high price of bread, you were a suspect. If you accidentally called someone monsieur instead of the mandatory title citizen, you were a suspect. If you were not enthusiastic enough about the revolution, you could be reported, arrested in the middle of the night, and executed the very next day. This is where biology acts as a perfect mirror for society. When a human body develops an autoimmune disease, its immune system becomes dangerously confused. It stops fighting outside infections and begins to violently attack the body's own healthy, vital organs. The French Republic had developed a political autoimmune disease. In its desperate attempt to purge foreign spies and royalist traitors, the government began to attack its own loyal citizens. The executions happened daily. The great public squares of Paris smelled heavily of copper and blood. First, the guillotine claimed the lives of the remaining royal family. In October 1793, Queen Marie Antoinette was placed in a wooden cart. Her beautiful hair had been roughly chopped off. She was driven through a hostile, screaming crowd and executed. But the blade did not stop with royalty. Listen for this verb: to eliminate. To eliminate means to completely remove or get rid of something or someone. Practice saying this phrase to yourself. The leaders decided to eliminate their political rivals. The radical Jacobins began to eliminate the moderate politicians. The men who had sat on the right side of the assembly, the men who had helped write the original Constitution, were hunted down. They were accused of not being pure enough in their revolutionary beliefs. Dozens of these educated, passionate leaders were sent to the guillotine in a single afternoon. Then came a tragic and fascinating twist. Like a fire that runs out of dry wood, the revolution began to burn its own architects. Consider a man named Georges Danton. Danton was a giant figure in the revolution. He was a massive, loud, charismatic man who had inspired the people to storm the Tuileries Palace. He was one of the founding fathers of the Republic. But by the spring of 1794, Danton looked at the endless rivers of blood and felt a deep disgust. He stood up in the government and bravely suggested that perhaps it was time to stop the killing. He suggested that the terror had gone too far. For Maximilien Robespierre, this suggestion was an unforgivable betrayal. Listen for this word: fanatic. A fanatic is a person filled with excessive, single-minded enthusiasm for an extreme political or religious cause. Robespierre had become a pure fanatic. To him, anyone who wanted to stop the terror was clearly a traitor to the Republic. Even his own close friends. Robespierre signed the arrest warrant for Georges Danton. When Danton was placed on trial, he defended himself with such a booming, powerful voice that crowds gathered outside the courthouse just to hear him through the open windows. The Committee of Public Safety was terrified that Danton's powerful speech might turn the people against them. So, they rapidly changed the legal rules right in the middle of the trial. They passed a decree stating that anyone who insulted the justice system would lose their right to speak. Danton was immediately silenced and sentenced to death. Danton was immediately silenced and sentenced to death. As Danton stood on the high wooden platform of the guillotine, he did not show fear. Historical accounts state that he looked directly at the executioner and gave one final, legendary command.
"Show my head to the people," Danton said. "It is worth seeing."
The heavy steel blade fell. The revolution was officially eating its own children. We have watched a government use the legal system to murder thousands of its own citizens. We have seen paranoia replace trust, and the guillotine replace the Constitution. But a vital question remains. Robespierre has eliminated the king, the queen, the moderates, and now his own radical friends. He stands completely alone at the very top of a mountain of power, ruling a silent, terrified nation. But what happens when the architect of the terror finally makes a fatal mistake in front of a room full of desperate politicians? And how does a country wake up from a nightmare of its own making? Imagine standing in front of a room filled with terrified politicians, holding up a blank piece of paper and telling them it contains a list of traitors. That single piece of paper ended the reign of terror. It is the brutal, sweltering summer of July 1794. The French government has even renamed the months of the year to erase all religious history, calling this hot summer month Thermidor. Maximilien Robespierre is now the undisputed master of France. He has executed the king, the queen, the moderate politicians, and his own closest friends. The guillotine is working faster than ever before. In Paris alone, hundreds of people are being executed every single month. But Robespierre is about to make a fatal, arrogant mistake. A tyrant is a cruel and oppressive ruler who holds absolute power. The revolution had started as a fight against the tyranny of a king. Now, many people secretly believed Robespierre had simply become a new kind of tyrant. Practice saying this phrase to yourself. The people realized he had become a tyrant. On July 26th, Robespierre walked into the National Convention. The room was tense. The politicians sat on heavy wooden benches, sweating in the summer heat, waiting for him to speak. Robespierre stepped up to the podium and delivered a long, threatening speech. He announced that he had uncovered a massive new plot against the Republic. A conspiracy is a secret plan by a group of people to do something unlawful or harmful. Robespierre declared that a dangerous conspiracy existed right there inside the government. He claimed he had a list of the guilty politicians. But then, he did something incredibly foolish. He refused to read the names. He left the podium and went home, leaving the politicians in the dark. This is where biology dictates the course of history. When a human being is trapped, the brain initially freezes in paralyzing fear. But if the threat is absolute and inescapable, the biological response suddenly flips. The freeze turns into aggressive, desperate survival. Every single politician in that room thought the exact same thing. Is my name on that list? Am I going to the guillotine tomorrow? Cornered and desperate, the politicians realized they only had one choice. They had to strike first. To overthrow means to remove a leader or a government from power by using force. The desperate politicians plotted to overthrow the government. The very next day, July 27th, or the 9th of Thermidor, Robespierre returned to the assembly to finally read his list. But the room had completely changed. The moment he tried to speak, the politicians began to shout. They slammed their hands on the wooden desks. They screamed, "Down with the tyrant!" Robespierre was shocked. He tried to yell over the incredible noise, but his voice failed him. He began to choke on his own words. According to a famous historical account, one brave politician pointed at him and yelled, "The blood of Danton chokes him!" The government immediately voted to arrest Robespierre and his closest radical allies. That night, Paris descended into total chaos. Robespierre and his followers were held in a building called the Hôtel de Ville. Armed forces loyal to the National Convention surrounded the building in the dark. As the soldiers stormed up the stairs, a gunshot rang out in the room where Robespierre was hiding. Historians debate exactly what happened in those chaotic final moments. Some evidence suggests Robespierre tried to take his own life, but his hand slipped. Other accounts claim a soldier burst into the room and shot him. Whatever the truth is, the result was horrific. The bullet shattered Robespierre's lower jaw. The next afternoon, the architect of the Reign of Terror faced his own machine. Robespierre was thrown into a wooden cart. His shattered jaw was tied together with a dirty bandage. As the cart rolled through the streets of Paris, the crowds did not sit in silent fear. They cheered. They celebrated. The spell of extreme paranoia was finally broken. When he was dragged up the wooden steps of the guillotine, the executioner roughly ripped the bandage from his face. Robespierre screamed in agony, a terrible sound that was quickly cut short by the falling steel blade. The Reign of Terror was dead. In the weeks that followed, the law of suspects was cancelled. The heavy iron doors of the prisons were thrown open, and thousands of terrified citizens finally walked free. The radical Jacobin clubs were forcibly closed. The French people were exhausted. They had endured 5 years of absolute madness, starvation, foreign wars, and public executions. They no longer wanted extreme equality or pure revolutionary virtue. They just wanted to feel safe. When a powerful leader is suddenly removed, it creates a power vacuum. This is a condition where no one is in control, and different groups rush in to grab the empty seat of power. France was now sitting in a massive power vacuum. A new, more conservative government called the Directory took over. But they were weak, corrupt, and constantly threatened by riots. The economy was still entirely bankrupt. The foreign kings of Europe were still attacking the borders. The Republic was fundamentally broken. We have watched a tyrant fall to his own brutal system. We have seen desperate politicians overthrow a radical regime just to survive. But a vital question opens up. The French people are desperately crying out for order, stability, and a strong military protector. Out on the battlefields, a young, brilliant artillery officer from a small island has been watching the chaos in Paris very closely. How does a republic that chopped off its king's head willingly hand absolute power over to a military emperor? Imagine thousands of angry rebels marching toward the government palace, only to be stopped by a young, fiercely determined officer pointing heavy cannons down a narrow city street. It is October of 1795. The Reign of Terror is over, and the guillotine is quiet. A new, more moderate government, called the Directory, is trying to rule France. But the country is still entirely bankrupt, and the people in the streets are still hungry. Seeing how weak the new government is, A massive crowd of royalists, people who want to bring a king back to power, decides to start a violent riot in Paris. They march on the government headquarters, intending to overthrow the Directory. The political leaders are terrified. Their best generals are far away, fighting at the borders. In desperation, they hand the defense of the palace over to a 26-year-old, unemployed military officer from the small island of Corsica. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. Artillery refers to large, heavy guns or cannons used in land warfare. Napoleon was an absolute genius with artillery. He did not try to negotiate with the massive mob. He positioned his heavy cannons at the ends of the narrow streets leading to the palace. He loaded the cannons not with solid iron cannonballs, but with grape shot, bags filled with hundreds of small metal balls that act like a massive shotgun. When the angry mob charged forward, Napoleon gave the order to fire. The result was bloody and immediate. The sheer force of the cannons cleared the streets in minutes. The Royalist rebellion was instantly crushed. Listen for this phrase: to restore order. This means to bring back peace and control after a period of chaos. You can practice saying this simple sentence: the young general used cannons to restore order. Because he saved the government, Napoleon Bonaparte became an overnight sensation. He was promoted and given command of the French army fighting in Italy. This brings us to a crucial biological mirror. Think of a human body running a dangerously high fever. The body fights the infection violently, sweating and shaking. But eventually, the body simply collapses from pure exhaustion. It stops fighting. It just wants to rest. By 1795, French society had been running a revolutionary fever for 6 brutal years. The people had survived riots, extreme paranoia, public executions, and foreign invasions. They were politically and emotionally exhausted. They no longer cared about perfect liberty or the pure ideals of the Republic. They just wanted bread, safe streets, and a strong leader to protect them. Napoleon Bonaparte was exactly the leader they were waiting for. When he went to Italy, his army was starving, wearing rags, and completely demoralized. But Napoleon possessed incredible charisma. He promised his soldiers glory and wealth. He led them into battle against the massive Austrian Empire, and, to the shock of all of Europe, he won. He won battle after battle, using brilliant, fast-moving military tactics that traditional generals simply could not understand. But Napoleon was not just a great military commander. He was a master of managing public opinion. Listen for this word: propaganda. Propaganda is biased or misleading information used to promote a political cause or point of view. Napoleon used brilliant propaganda. He started his own newspapers and sent them back to Paris. He commissioned beautiful paintings of himself, looking like a fearless, invincible hero. Even when he later led an army to Egypt and his fleet was entirely destroyed by the British Navy, his propaganda in Paris made it sound like a glorious scientific and military triumph. By the autumn of 1799, the situation in Paris had deteriorated again. The Directory was deeply corrupt, unpopular, and out of money. The people despised the politicians. Napoleon saw his perfect opportunity. He secretly left his army in Egypt, sailed back to France, and arrived in Paris not as a disgraced general, but as a returning savior. He formed a secret alliance with a few powerful politicians to take control of the failing republic. Listen closely to this historical term, coup d'état. This is actually a French phrase that we use directly in the English language. A coup d'état, or simply a coup, is a sudden, violent, and illegal seizure of power from a government. Practice saying this phrase aloud. The general led a military coup d'état. On November 9, 1799, in a moment known to history as the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon executed his plan. He walked directly into the government assembly hall, surrounded by his loyal, heavily armed soldiers. The politicians were furious. They realized they were being overthrown. They shouted at Napoleon, calling him a dictator and an outlaw. A few politicians even physically attacked him. But Napoleon's brother, Lucien, boldly ordered the soldiers to draw their swords and clear the room. The terrified politicians jumped out of the windows and ran into the forest to escape the military blades. That evening, a small, hand-picked group of remaining politicians was forced to legally dissolve the Directory. They created a new government and named Napoleon Bonaparte the first consul. Although they still used the word republic, the democratic experiment of the French Revolution was effectively over. 10 years after the starving people of Paris tore down the Bastille to destroy the absolute power of a king, they had willingly handed absolute power over to a military general. We have watched a brilliant artillery officer crush a rebellion, conquer foreign enemies, and use propaganda to make himself a national hero. We have seen a tired, broken society surrender its democratic freedoms just to feel safe and strong again. But a massive, lingering loop remains open. Did millions of people suffer and die for absolutely nothing? If France just traded a royal king for a military emperor, what was the actual point of the revolution? How did those bloody 10 years permanently change the definition of human rights? And how did they secretly plant the seeds for the modern world we live in today? Imagine standing inside a magnificent cathedral, watching the most powerful man in the world approach the leader of his religion. But instead of bowing his head to receive a golden crown, he reaches out, takes the heavy crown from the Pope's hands, and places it squarely onto his own head. It is December 2nd, 1804, inside the freezing, echoing walls of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Napoleon Bonaparte is officially declaring himself the Emperor of France. By placing the crown on his own head, he is sending a brilliant, unmistakable message to the entire world. He is declaring that his absolute power does not come from God. It does not come from an ancient royal bloodline. His power comes entirely from his own merit, his own military victories, and the support of the French people. But as you watch this glorious, glittering ceremony, a deeply disturbing question arises. Just 11 years earlier, the French people chopped off the head of King Louis XVI because they absolutely hated the idea of a single, all-powerful ruler. They fought, starved, and died by the thousands to build a free republic. Now, they are cheering for a new emperor. Did the revolution fail completely? Was all that terrible bloodshed for nothing? To answer that, we have to look beneath the surface of the new empire. Napoleon was a dictator, yes, but he did not destroy the revolution. He organized it. Listen for this verb, to consolidate. To consolidate means to combine things into a single, more effective or stronger whole. You can practice saying this simple phrase. The emperor wanted to consolidate his power. Napoleon consolidated the massive, chaotic changes of the previous 10 years. During the revolution, the government had written thousands of confusing new rules. Napoleon ordered his experts to organize them all into one single, clear document. Listen for this word, code. In historical and legal English, a code is a systematic collection of laws. In 1804, he published the Civil Code, later known across the world as the Napoleonic Code. This code was truly revolutionary. Before 1789, if you were born a poor farmer, you died a poor farmer. The law treated you differently than a wealthy noble. But under the Napoleonic Code, the ancient system of feudalism was completely, permanently erased. The law stated clearly that all male citizens were absolutely equal before the law. It established the strict protection of private property. It stated that government jobs must be given to people based on their talent and intelligence, not on who their parents were. We must use careful phrasing here, as historians correctly point out a dark shadow over this document. While the code protected the rights of men, it actively took rights away from women, placing them firmly under the legal control of their husbands or fathers. The fight for true, universal equality still had a very long way to go. Yet the core ideas of the revolution had survived the chaos. They had simply changed shape. This brings us to a final, profound biological mirror. Think of a massive, terrifying forest fire. As it burns, it destroys beautiful old trees. It creates choking, dark smoke. It seems entirely destructive and evil. But when the fire finally stops, something remarkable happens. The intense heat forces seeds buried deep in the dirt to finally crack open. The thick ash from the burnt wood provides perfect, rich nutrients for the soil. Within a few years, an entirely new, stronger forest grows in its place. The French Revolution was a terrifying political fire. It burned down centuries of ancient tradition. It killed tens of thousands of people in a wave of paranoia and terror. But in the ashes of that destroyed kingdom, the seeds of the modern world were planted. Listen for this word, legacy. A legacy is something handed down from the past, or the long-lasting impact of a historical event. What is the true legacy of the French Revolution? First, it gave us the practical tools of modern society. The revolution completely redesigned how we measure the world, inventing the metric system, meters, liters, and grams, because they wanted a logical system based on science, not a confusing system based on a king's foot. But more importantly, it changed how human beings understand their own value. Listen for this powerful word, nationalism. Nationalism is a deep identification with one's own nation and support for its interests. Before the revolution, people fought for a king. They were called subjects. But the revolution created the concept of the nation. The people realized that the country belonged to them. They were citizens. When Napoleon's massive armies marched across Europe, conquering other countries, they did not just carry cannons and muskets. They carried this contagious idea. They brought the Napoleonic Code, the destruction of feudalism, and the spirit of nationalism to Italy, Germany, and beyond. The kings of Europe eventually united and defeated Napoleon at the famous Battle of Waterloo in 1815. They even forced a new king back onto the French throne. But it was far too late. The fire had already changed the soil. You cannot force a butterfly back into a caterpillar. Once ordinary people experienced the taste of equality, once they read a constitution that promised them natural human rights, they would never permanently accept a tyrant again. The ideas born in the bloody streets of Paris inspired future revolutions across Europe, throughout South America, and across the globe for the next 2 centuries. We have traveled through a brutal, beautiful, and deeply complex chapter of human history. We have watched starving peasants storm an invincible fortress. We have seen a king fall to a terrible machine and an empire rise from the ashes. We have explored the vocabulary of defiance, terror, and freedom. History is not just a list of dead names and old dates. It is the story of human nature, written in blood and ink, echoing into the very language we speak today. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. Keep listening, keep learning, and never forget that the words you use have the power to change the world.